Hello everyone, welcome to another Sensemaker Live, our first back here after a summer break. I'm Giles, Whittell, an editor at Tortoise, joined by colleagues including Claudia on chat, Sam with some headphones on, Imi without headphones on, Phoebe, I can't tell where you are, Phoebe, in our new office. Welcome to you and everybody else at the end of a week that began with the elevation of Simon Case, age 41, to the post of Cabinet Secretary, the youngest to hold that post since the very first person to hold that post. So that was what was happening near the top of government, while closer to the bottom of government, we had continuing chaos, if you'll forgive the journalistic cliche, in the business of COVID testing, with the BBC drawing long red lines across the map of the UK to indicate routes that citizens had been advised to take to get from where they live to where they could be tested. Just today, we've had the airlines begging the government to start testing people on arrival in UK airports, as they have been for months in Hong Kong and elsewhere. And you may well ask, why on earth not here? And in the meantime, Dominic Cummings, senior aide to the Prime Minister, has floated plans for digital ID cards for all of us, which he says will revolutionize the use of data across government. That at least is the Times paraphrase of Number 10 spokesperson's words. And this is all in the context, of course, of the I've got to use the word chaos again, that many of us, especially those who've had anxious kids, have been experiencing over the summer to do with exams. At last this week, some of those kids have gone back to school. So during this week in Sensemaker, one of the things that I wrote somewhat grumpily was about Boris Johnson refusing to meet COVID victims' families in person. And Matt D'Ancona, my colleague, yesterday wrote a bit less grumpily, a bit more room for optimism, about the government's £500 million gamble on new forms of testing. I can't help but say that these would be new to us, but of course are being trialled elsewhere in the world somewhat quicker. And we're going to hear more from Matt and all you, I hope, a bit later. I should go through the drill for a think-in for those of you who don't know it. The whole point is to hear from all of you. So I'll be quiet quite soon. You can draw attention to the fact that you want to say something by raising your digital hand at the bottom of the participants column. Click on that and you can raise your hand, bottom right-hand corner, or tap away in the chat and Claudia will be keeping an eye on that. Now, we were going to be joined today by another guest, almost as special as Matt, Dr. Dominic Pimenta. Unfortunately, he had to cancel at very short notice because his wife is unwell, and we wish her well. And we hope that Dominic can come back and talk to us another time, because it was his story that got us thinking this week about Number 10, Cummings, and COVID. I'll summarize it very briefly. He is 33. You may know all about him if you've read about him or read his book. He's a junior cardiologist at an East London hospital who, when Dominic Cummings went on violated lockdown guidelines to go to Barnard Castle, had a sense of humour failure and tweeted, after much thought, but cutting a long story short, and I've got his tweet here. This is me right now heading back into the COVID ICU I've worked in for the last 2 months. This stuff is hot and hard work. Haven't seen my parents since January. Frankly, Cummings spits in the face of all our efforts, the whole NHS. If he doesn't resign, I will. Cummings didn't resign, and Dr. Pimenta did. And he has since gone on to write a book, Duty of Care, about the background to that tweet and what has followed it. So Cummings' non-resignation, arrogance or a sense of mission not yet complete or barely begun, or a combination of the two? If both, Matt, fair warning, I'd like to ask you, what on earth is the mission that Cummings thinks he's on? But I think we're going to get towards the end of this hour towards the issue of accountability and blame, if you prefer that word. And there is a debate already forming about whether the process of holding this government to account for serial failures, but some of which are understandable, let's accept that, over the course of this year, whether that process should begin now or, as the government would prefer, later. So just to flex your digimuscles, please go to the raise hand button and tap it if you think that process of starting a public inquiry should start now, bearing in mind that it takes some time to get going and appoint the right people. Okay, here we go. People who think now. I often think I rush this bit because some people take a while and we're still getting hands going up. Great. And who thinks it should start later, as the government would prefer? James, you can't be on both sides of this argument. There we go. Okay. All right. You guys are in a minority, and that's always interesting. I hope very much that we can hear from some of you. But first, Matt, back to Cummings and his non-resignation and everything that he's been up to since. What's he up to?
Well, I think he's up to three things which are profoundly entangled. The first is that for as long as I've known of him, been aware of him, he's been obsessed by what he sees as the arthritic, old-fashioned, old-school tie nature of the British state. And so, in as much as it was always his ambition to get into the command and control room of Number 10, he was always going to want to overturn the institutions of state. And we're seeing some of that already. The merging of the Foreign Office and Department for International Development, the abolition of Public Health England and its replacement by the National Institute for Health Protection, lots of changes going on in Number 10 in the Cabinet Office, and so on. And that was always going to be part of the Cummings offer. He's obsessed by things like mission control in the 1960s. One of his great heroes is an American Air Force colonel called John Boyd, who he frequently references, who was a great sort of disruptor. And
wait, are we talking NASA mission control?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Gene Kranz.
Failure
is not an option.
He is obsessed by that. I mean, he sees government as a rocket, and genuinely believes that there is a culture within British government that is partly subconsciously, partly actively hostile to things getting done. That's his populism. So that's number one. Number two was the small matter of getting the practicalities of Britain out of the European Union. A task which would have occupied a government even of tremendous capacity, intellect, organisation and competence for a full year. And that would have been the main task of this year, and interlinked with his belief that what the American right called the deep state were trying to thwart this. So that's task number two. Mm-hmm. And then task number three is the small matter of coping with a pandemic. And obviously the what we hope earnestly is that the first and only peak of the pandemic in this country having passed, there is now a kind of subterranean blame game starting, because whenever the inquiry is held, whether if the government, as the government would like, the official inquiry is held sometime in the 2030s, or as it should be now, they are making their dispositions to ensure that the blame lies, for example, with Public Health England rather than with the politicians who made key decisions at key moments. So you have these three simultaneous, interlinked, massive tasks, any one of which would overwhelm a half-competent government. In the midst of this, as you said, the appointment of Simon Case is fascinating because he is, as you said, Darcy, the youngest person to be appointed to the role of Cabinet Secretary, 41. And the general assumption has been made that given his past, he was a private secretary to Cameron, to Prince William, he was involved in the Brexit negotiations. It's assumed that he is going to be a Cummings, Boris Johnson stooge. And that may indeed be their assumption. I think it's just always worth putting in a caveat on things like that. Never forget that when Rishi Sunak was appointed Chancellor, everyone said, oh, he's there as number 10's yes man. Not so much now. Simon Case is known around Whitehall as a very, very able person. And it may well be that he's more sympathetic to Cummings' agenda than Mark Sedwill, his predecessor, and he may well indeed work well with him. But I think it's always a mistake to think that the people of quality that get to the top of the civil service, like Case, are simply going to be nodding dogs. I think he will be, as much a representative of civil service tradition as he will be a destroyer of it. So I think that story may be more interesting than we're led to suppose.
Right. Great. Thank you, Matt. Lindsay Evans, I see that you've got your hand up, and I will definitely come to you in a minute. And James Harding, my colleague, I know that you have a kind of a theory about what's going on in government, even if none of us know where it's going to end. Oh, I see, Lindsay, you've lowered your hand. Okay, fair enough. But first, while talking about Case, let's remember that there's been collateral damage up to this point, and we've got a slide. It's only a one-slide guide today to show you the extent of departures. These 5 names have one thing in common. They're all permanent secretaries or cabinet secretaries who have left the government, 5 of them in the past 6 months. Jonathan Slater, Permanent Secretary of the Department of Education, left just in the last few days, taking the fall, one might argue, for the exams fiasco, while Williamson remains in office. Sir Richard Heaton resigned after quote-unquote challenging years. My colleagues may know more about that story than I do. Sedwill resigned on left office on the 28th of June, 3 days after Dominic Cummings let it be known that a hard rain was coming to the senior civil service. So Simon MacDonald strayed out of his silo. So he ran the Foreign Office, and as we were saying earlier this week, actually, made the mistake of wandering into the public debate on COVID and PPE, and let it be known that he thought that the decision by the UK government not to take part in an EU procurement programme for PPE, personal protective equipment, was a political decision. He left soon afterwards. There'd been some fairly bad blood between him and Boris Johnson at the Foreign Office when Johnson was Foreign Secretary as well. And the first of the 5 to go, Philip Rutnam, alleged a vicious and orchestrated campaign against him at the Home Office, basically starting when Priti Patel took over there. So at the moment, in civil service terms, Case seems to be the winner, but as Matt says, he may well not turn out to be the yes man that some of his ministerial overlords hope. But on the way to that point, some older, greyer men have fallen by the wayside. No women, interestingly. James, if you're around, you seized upon Dominic Pimenta's story when we were discussing it earlier in the week as a way into, as a window on the larger tectonic movements. We are inclined, perhaps, to look at the Cummings story in a shallow way and regard him as an aide in up to his neck, if not over his head, anxious to shift blame when things go wrong, and they're going wrong. But is there a larger project in his mind, and should we be taking it more seriously?
So, Giles, I think I once interviewed the chief executive of the Sichuan New Hope grain company. And when I asked him, before we get started, is there anything you want to say? He said, yes, there are 7 phases to the development of the Sichuan New Hope grain company. And 2 hours and 20 minutes later, he finished his preamble. And there's a danger that in this area, I'm going to be the same. I think that there are some things that it's really easy for people to get worked up about. Barnard Castle, driving to test your eyesight, particularly on your wife's birthday, is clearly one of them. But if you step away from that and say, all right, let's put ourselves in the shoes of Dominic Cummings and those people who make his argument, I think there are, I suppose, 4 big things that are really worth digesting or investigating. The first is just to pick up on your point to begin with, which is this a sense of mission or is this personal arrogance? I think there's something really profound that's happening in Western societies, and it's often put as populism, but you could look at it in a different lens, and it's the idea that the counterculture that in the 60s and 70s was dominated by the left is now dominated by the right. That the people who say, we need to kick the establishment, we need to stop the stuffed shirts and the old fogies from dominating everything, come from the right. And so the sense that you get from someone like Dominic Cummings is that his purpose in life is to try to revolutionize Britain, to unleash Britain, to modernize Britain. Right? And he sees the big obstacle to that being the establishment, being the government. Now, many people would say that may be ironic, come from someone with his ties and history and links, etc. But that's the argument. It takes you to the second point, which is when you go back and you read Dom Cummings's blogs, and I remember reading them, I was delayed on a train once, and I sat on a station platform for a couple of hours and just read, particularly his very, very long blogs post-Brexit. The thing that was just astonishing to me was that he wasn't motivated in Brexit by the idea of free trade Britain, certainly not the immigration arguments, not even kind of quote unquote the strict European Court of Justice take back control arguments. His big thinking around Brexit was that Brexit was a means to a further end, which was to revolutionise government itself. And you could never do that while it was constrained by the requirements of membership of the European Union. And then the third thing to understand, I think, with them, and the thing to actually sort of check in ourselves, is that the argument I think that they're making against the civil service and against the government is that when the public and often the press points the finger at politicians, those inside government say, hang on a second, it's very well to blame the minister, but the truth is these problems are happening within government itself. And that point of view, I think, existed in Dominic Cummings before he moved into government, but it was certainly cemented by his experience working with Michael Gove at the Department for Education, and their so-called battle against the blob, the teaching establishment, proved it. It's really striking when you look at your list of ministers, which departments they come from. Home Office, Foreign Office, Department for Education. these are the places where, in their own ways, Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson, and others have experience of government and believe that the administration of government, what Matt just called the deep state, is an obstacle to the kind of change they think that needs to be made. And so that takes you to the sort of fourth point, I suppose, which is, yes, Dominic Cummings is very, very unpopular. I happen to think that he's serving increasingly a useful purpose for Downing Street as a lightning rod for unpopularity and a way of preventing people from paying attention to the other people at the centre of government that really should be subject to a greater degree of scrutiny. But when you ask yourself the question, do you believe that British government has in the past 6 months shown itself to be nimble, to be good at learning on its feet, to be effective and competent? The argument that I think you'd hear from a lot of people is no. Mm-hmm. And so the curious thing is, for as much as Dominic Cummings may be unpopular, the argument of taking on the establishment, taking on the civil service, taking on the Sir Humphreys, and forcing changes to the way in which British government works, I suspect that actually could be quite popular.
I suspect you're right, but winding up the PHE in the middle of the pandemic?
Let's just take that as that's a brilliant example, right? So Thursday night, 8 o'clock, you're on your doorstep clapping the NHS. And actually, as I was cycling in today, I was looking at the windows. The rainbows are everywhere, right? They're a little faded, but they're everywhere. But there's something is happening, because by winding up the PHE, Public Health England, one of the things that's happening is that the government is opening a conversation that so far has been behind closed doors, which is, yes, we are hugely grateful for the courage of people on the front lines in the NHS, but yes, too, we need to address failures within the NHS exposed by this pandemic. And one of the points, Matt and I were talking about this earlier in the week, one of the things that's really interesting was the huge variability in outcomes depending on which hospital you ended up at, mm-hmm. and particularly early on in March, April. And one of the things that suggests to you, and the people who studied it look at a variability of between 15 and 85% between some London teaching hospitals elsewhere around the country, what they say is, that surely tells us things about the extent to which the NHS works, its capacity to learn from itself, not to mention other countries. And the PHE example may seem like a deflection, may seem in the same way that the sort of Sally Collier departure from Ofqual is a deflection from ministerial responsibility, but it also is a way that we're being let in on what the government's real thinking is about the people who work in the administration of government, NHS included.
Right, thanks. Okay. Louise Simpson, you've been very busy in the chat, and I know this started with a debate on when to start an inquiry, but I'm looking at the mindset of indolence and acceptance of the status quo. Louise, do you mind if we turn the mic on you?
No, not at all.
Who's indolent and accepting the status quo here? What side are you on?
Well, I just think the way the government has been run, probably for hundreds of years, is indolent and self-satisfied, and it just simply isn't seeing what most people in this country live through. I mean, they are completely ignorant of the world that's going on around them, and Cummings tapped into what people were thinking in the Brexit thing. So, he has a successful track record in kind of understanding what real people are thinking about, rather than just government officials. And sorry, I've just lost the thread of what I'm saying. But no, I think that the whole way the country is run seriously needs to be readdressed. And when I say go back to the social compact, I think we all need to work out how to all live with each other in a totally changed world to the 19th century system that we're still living within.
So is the corollary, all power to him, go ahead with your disruption even now as we try to deal with the pandemic and get out of Europe?
No, I think he's appalling. I mean, I think anyone who can genuinely work for Johnson is pretty appalling. But he is right in the desperate need for change. But I don't think smashing everything down, and I don't like the civil service particularly either, all the way it runs, but I don't think smashing it down is necessarily the way forward. I think in France they have a sort of school where people who are going to work in the civil service are brought up for ages and ages and ages and taught how things work. So maybe you could have, the first rule should be that people like Cummings shouldn't be allowed to just go in and break things up. Breaking things up is very easy, and that's what he seems to be fully intent on doing, as they all are. But how you keep what's good still sort of existing, I don't know. I do think the country is in a terrible mess, and I've thought that for a long, long time. And Brexit crowned it for me, absolutely crowned it. So,
well, thank you very much. You referenced France. Andrew Girdwood in the chat is saying James's argument is interesting but England-centric. Can you expand, if we can come to you, Andrew, on what you think that the Westminster might learn from Wales and Scotland?
No,
or am I misunderstanding that?
Close. So I was hearing the need for desperate and fundamental change, a rebuilding of everything to make it work, which echoes yesterday's thinking when we heard about how the Western governments are sliding behind Eastern structures, which are much more lean and efficient. But Wales, Scotland can just start again, can start afresh, because strongly considering getting rid of Westminster. And the more it's obvious that Westminster doesn't work, the more convincing the argument becomes.
So in the Scottish case, you're talking about full-on independence. Are you talking about that in Wales as well?
Oh, it's my understanding that independence is growing in popularity in Wales, despite them voting for Brexit. Then it's a disillusionment of the Westminster system.
But to a strange extent, if you're right, and I suspect you are, about the growing impatience and the desire for a clean sheet, it's certainly in Holyrood. If James is right too, then actually Cummings is on the same side of this argument. And I wanted to come back, James, to the idea of, let's take seriously the idea of Cummings' desire to revolutionize government, and return to the thesis in John Micklethwaite and Adrian Wooldridge's thinking, that in the East, smaller governments have shown themselves to be capable of being a great deal more efficient as well. It's become a cliche here to moan about the prospect of Brexiteers trying to turn the UK into another Singapore. But is there a model like Singapore that is lodged in Cummings' mind, and goes for that matter?
So Giles, will you allow me just one thing? I do think that Andrew's absolutely right, that I am being too England-centric, too Westminster-centric. And one of the sort of strange dual ideas that, if you like, the conservative revolutionaries, and I think there is a kind something about the sort of libertarian Leninists of the in this government, but the thing that's difficult is that they are holding two ideas in their head at the same time. One is fundamental radical change, a huge modernization of Britain and its government, and at the same time a defense of its institutions and its traditions. And so the interesting thing here is that you've got people who are, on the one hand, in favor of much greater devolution, in favor of much more direct and effective government, and at the same time are defending very strongly the union. So I completely buy your point, Andrew, that, where the way this must look, if you're sitting in Scotland or Wales in particular, or Northern Ireland for that matter, is it actually accelerates the arguments, as we've seen in Scotland, for independence. To Louise's point, I completely understand your view, which is, hang on, look at what this has revealed about the calibre of government and the state of government. I think that the thing that's really sort of complicated for the government is that the politics goes directly against the grain of a smaller, enterprise-focused, let animal spirits rip government in the UK. And the reason for that is essentially twofold. One is the pandemic and the amount of money that's been burned. So when you start talking about moving corporation tax from 19 to 24% or harmonizing income and capital gains tax, goodbye Singapore on Thames, right? That's not a low tax free enterprise economy. It's interesting that lots of people in Westminster these days are fascinated by Rishi Sunak's obsession with free ports. Tells you a little bit about the way they think, right? But the second point is that the politics of Boris Johnson's 80-seat majority is about provision of public services and public investment. And so in both senses, the image that people have got, it's not so much Singapore now as South Korea, is challenged by the political circumstances of the UK.
Thanks, James. Daniel Dipper, luxuriating, I hope, in your confirmed offer. I just want to come on to the question of when this process of holding the government to account, or at least inquiring what has gone wrong, should start. And as I understand it, you raised your hand for a bit of delay. Why is that?
Yes, yeah. I think that we're kind of in the middle of it all. I do actually know that internally the civil service are actually looking at lessons learned to implement for this winter. But I don't think that it's the time now to kind of, I hope this isn't too crude, but drag out all the hurt that has been experienced over the last few months and the trauma and the stress. I think that it needs to be an objective inquiry. And I think that possibly if it was done now, there'd possibly be too much of a sense of urgency. Don't get me wrong, an inquiry is definitely got to happen. But I just kind of fear that if it was to start now, there would be a sudden rush. The people who actually were involved in the inquiry would have to be very, very carefully selected, which would be a concern because we do want it to be objective. We do seriously want to use it to look at a wider model of what needs to change in society. But I just don't feel it's the right time. I think that it is the right time for these internal reviews that are taking place. But I just feel dragging it all out into public when we're kind of in the middle of it all, I just feel could get very, very messy. And I know that this phrase I'm going to say now could be interpreted in a number of ways, but I feel that by doing it now, it could seriously undermine public trust in the government. And as much as many people don't like the government, they did win the election. So technically they do have a mandate. And I just fear that if they was to do it now, the damage would be that then people wouldn't listen to the government when actually they do need to on some of the measures that have been put in place. And I fear that actually it would lead to further discoordination, which is not what we want. We need to be united because chances are it is going to get worse again in the winter and we've got to be prepared.
Okay, so a strong case for everyone pulling together, as it were, in the short term. Yasmin Abdul-Majid, I see you in the chat. Possibly responding to what James was saying about what revolution in government looks like to Cummings. What do you make of the idea that extraordinary circumstances and a big majority actually don't point to slimmed down, low tax, hyper efficient, but bigger government and a bigger state? I mean, there are two questions here, aren't there? What sort of government do you hope would emerge from this? And the question that you pose, what is the vision of government in Cummings' mind? What do you think, first of all, that Cummings is thinking?
Oh gosh, if I had the answer to that, I'm not sure what Cummings is thinking, but what I think to your question is interesting is that often people who want small government don't want small government that doesn't help them generally. And it's a much more ideological piece than it is a realistic one. I mean, say, for example, a lot of Republicans would say that they believe in small government, and yet they are the first to look to ask the government to be bailed out during financial crises, and they tend to generally came out of the financial crisis pretty well. They will probably come out of this recession pretty well as well. So I think it's often less about small government and more about government that doesn't help the small people, as it were. And I'm genuinely curious about this idea of what Cummings's revolution looks like, because I think lots of people want to revolutionize government. I don't think, to James's point, I don't think there's a huge group of people saying the system kind of really works super well, but I don't fully understand what his vision is, and maybe I also need to sit down and read his blog. But I'm curious about that because it also, he's in a position of power, and they have enough of a majority to make those changes. And we are only year one into a 5-year term. Like, there is time and enough of a majority for there to be a genuine change. And so part of it for me as well is figuring out how do we A, figure out what he wants to do, and then B, decide how to shape or influence or fight it if it isn't something that we agree with, because what position are people in to do so?
James, did you mean to have your hand up? We'll come back to you, and then William, I promise we'll come to you.
Yes, I just wanted to go back to Yasmin, because Yasmin, I think, do read the blogs. It's really interesting, because when you read them, some of it jars with you, but the thing that you're in no doubt about is what he wants to do. So I'm not clear exactly what Boris Johnson thinks. Exactly what really are the economics of Boris Johnson. I'm not clear. But Dominic Cummings, here are some things. He definitely wants to decentralise out of London, right? And thinks that power is much too centralised in London. He definitely thinks that there is a talent problem inside the civil service, inside government. They need to bring in fresh and different people because it's samey. And perhaps the most important thing is that he thinks that there's a lack of use of data and technology and an underinvestment in science in the UK, right? Now, he says these things again and again and again, and I've no doubt at all that if it was Gary Lineker making that case, people would go, yeah, that's a good idea. We should get behind that. And I suppose that's the thing that's interesting to me, is that at the moment, one of the whole things of this pandemic has been the communications fiasco at the heart of government, not explaining their thinking. But it's really interesting. If you go back to Michael Gove's speech, do you remember Michael Gove gave a speech at Ditchley earlier this year? It was very much in the same theme of modernisation of government, use of data, a capacity to learn, admission of mistakes. And so that's the reason why I think that maybe the hard rein on the civil service, while it's played within Westminster and Whitehall, feels like a bubble conversation. But when people think about the problem, I think there's going to be more sympathy for the agenda than we might think right now.
Thanks, James. William, I promised we'd come to you. What's on your mind?
Hello. I'm just wondering if we're not taking any of these personalities in too high regard of their own conceit, as it were, because many of these themes have been put forward by people in past times. I was much struck by that famous press conference that Dominic Cummings gave in the Rose Garden, the whole, trip press conference, that it seemed to me to be a little bit like that moment at the end of the film The Wizard of Oz, when the curtain was raised and this wizard who had purported to rule the world and had sort of struck fear into the heart of, in our case, Whitehall, came across as someone who was not necessarily a master of the universe. Now, that's not to say that some of his themes are not right, but I've been much struck by Matt Dancona's long essay about Cummings and, you know, the amateurism of the government in certain departments. Times past, a special advisor was Arnold Goodman being rung up by Harold Wilson. Now, we've come on since then, but I'm just wondering whether there's an enormous gap between, if you like, the ability to analyze, the ability to put forward arguments, the ability to write wonderful speeches and enlightened articles, and actually there's a real world change going on. And I'm not entirely sure if, for example, admiring NASA and, you know, the great moon project doesn't completely misunderstand that was a great intent by government and private industry, and you need more than just one guy having brilliant ideas at the heart of number 10 with a rather uncollegiate, like, to put it politely, way of operating. So
yeah, it's a fair point. I think, and it would be good to come back to Matt in a bit before we run out of time, because I know that he is of the less than meets the eye school of thought on Cummings. But let's not obsess about him. If you don't mind me coming straight to you, Julie Bishop, you've said in the chat that, if I understand you right, we are not paying enough attention to sort of brute political calculation in what's going on in number 10.
Yes, that's right. I think, James, I too have watched a number of Dominic Cummings speeches and his explanation of what he's doing, and he's certainly a fascinating character at any rate. However, the discussion here today is really sort of talking about the merit of dismantling the civil service and changing how government works. And I know we all have frustrations with the civil service, with government, and I think a fair amount of blame will eventually sit at their door for lack of imagination, slowness in moving, etc. But in terms of what is it that's motivating this government, what is the relationship between Cummings, Gove and Boris Johnson? What do they stand for? Who really has the power in government? What are the ideas leading us forward? And I think once you look at those ideas, that's when you start to get scared, or when you start to think this is very anti-democratic. I think the fact that they were prepared to prorogue government, our parliament, when they did, I think that now they're attacking judicial review, and it feels like spite. They're doing that because this is where the public is able to hold government to account. So on the one hand, they're talking about civil servants, but it feels like they're attacking accountability, and it feels like they're attacking the independence, the independent role of the state, because their big issues are a no-deal Brexit, a free market economy. If you look at Michael Gove and parental control over education, you have to ask who benefits from this, and where is the safety net, and how does our democracy survive that?
Sorry, that last point, I'm not sure that I quite followed. You're saying there's an anti-democratic element to what Gove has in mind for education?
No, I'm saying that if you look at gave and Dominic Cummings' idea about the reform of schools, education, it's all about the individual, you know, the individual having control, the removal of state. I was just using that as a very, you know, pointed example of where we see their ideas playing out. And they are attractive in some ways until you start to think about who benefits and who loses, and where are the safety nets, etc.
Julie, where do you stand on the issue of the process of accountability? I see James's hand has gone up again, and we're going to come to him in a second, but I just want to tee up, if I may, the remaining 14 minutes. I want to ask everybody, because we have toyed with the idea. I hope I'm not betraying any scoops here. We've toyed with the idea of holding a public inquiry ourselves, or an inquiry of sorts.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be really interesting to know from everybody, whether you work for Tortoise or whether you're a member, is that premature? But more particularly, whenever one is held, what are the key questions? So if you don't mind thinking about that and raising your hand, if you'd like to get a question on the docket right away, let's do that. So that's a question for you, Julie. It's also a question, Matt, I'm going to come back to you on that. But first, James, what's on your mind?
Sorry, I've done exactly what I said, which is talk much too much. But I just wanted to say, I thought
you did give us fair warning, I have to say.
But because I just want to say, I thought Julie's point is brilliant, and it absolutely gets to the heart of this whole issue. I take Yasmin's point in the chat, which is all very well to bring in new talent, but the people they bring in don't look like talent to me. There's a different point, though, which I think is the most difficult one. It's the one that I think, Julie, you put your finger on, which is the reason that there's an attack on the education establishment. The reason that there is this argument with the judiciary and over judicial review, the prorogation of Parliament, these are all arguments about the same thing. They're all about executive power. And in their view, if you're going to change this country, and it sorely needs changing, you need executive power to do this, right? And sort of inferring from your comments, Julie, if you're going to safeguard freedoms in this country from the overreach of executive power, you need to have the independence, impartiality of the civil service, judiciary, etc. But this is the heart of the argument that we're in, and I realise that this can all sound slightly kind of theoretical, but the world we're living in, it's not theoretical. We're seeing this happen, and it just struck me as you said that you know, you go back to Giles's slide right at the start. Which are the departments where people have sacked civil servants? Education, justice, home. I've forgotten the full list. Cabinet office and foreign. Right? These are where these fundamental arguments about executive power. So I just think I was really just interrupting to say I agree with your point.
Well, I mean, James, you're really leading us into perhaps more interesting and less procedural territory, namely what the heck's going to happen to this country, what sort of government are we going to get, but I still want to conduct this experiment, if we can, to see if we can draw up a preliminary list of questions for an inquiry about the situation in which we find ourselves now. And Julie, I want to give you first dibs. What would you ask? What truth do you want to get at?
It's a hard question. I mean, to me, the issue is to what extent they, in the beginning, they were more caught up in their own political agenda than saving lives, really. I have a feeling, I don't know, that perhaps the whole Brexit drive was underneath a lot of it. I know it was hinted at. But I think the real questions are, how were decisions being made? What scientific advice they did listen to? Why didn't they listen to scientific advice? Why were they slow to move? I think they're the key questions. You know, the failure of PPE is one thing in itself that you could delve into, but I certainly think there needs to be a public inquiry now, and possibly I should say that through my work we have gathered together a coalition of NGOs calling for an immediate public inquiry. So,
what's the coalition called?
Well, it's led by law centres, and there's a number of other agencies, Liberty, Amnesty, etc., who are involved in it. I could send you the letter we sent to government if you're at all interested. Oh, yes. You'll be surprised to know they said no.
Yes, please do send the letter. Are there, in your view, practical reasons, as distinct from moral ones, why that process needs to start now?
Yes, because I think they're covering up as we go. I think part of the Public Health England is to deflect blame, and also I do think that so many people have died. Someone spoke about the hurt. I think the hurt needs to be addressed immediately, and I think people who have suffered the most, we've heard about the number of doctors and nurses and medical workers who have died, but where's the accountability for the cleaners, the bus drivers, and other groups who have died serving the country, really, disproportionately through poor, I think, political decision making. And I think it needs to happen now rather than later, because we need to learn the lessons now so it can be better managed. Not, you know, of course, people want to lay blame, but this isn't over yet. And while they might be learning lessons internally, but people need to feel there's accountability. They need to feel that their father, mother, uncle hasn't died. I think on one of these think-ins, you had Nazir Afzal, and I think he spoke with great clarity and compassion about why people need a response now, not in 3 years' time when it suits government.
Thank you. He's bringing proceedings against the government for the death of his brother to COVID. Just in defense of the system, is it not the case that we've had inquiries that start and finish years after the event, Bloody Sunday, Hillsborough, etc., which have shown an ability eventually to get at the truth? I kind of agree with you in my gut, but I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Yes, that's the real problem, and that is something we're considering, that it might be something that takes 12 years. And in fact, it doesn't, it costs a lot of money and no one's any happier. And if we look at the Grenfell inquiry, we're seeing that unfolding now. So calling for a public inquiry, in fact, may not be the best way forward. But I just come back to accountability. It just feels like the public are removed, the public are suffering, and there needs to be some sort of dialogue. You know, it's affecting every individual in such a different way to many situations that we face. And to me, that's the issue. But I'm prepared if someone has a better idea than a public inquiry, but it's the accountability that we're after, really. The accountability to people who have suffered.
And just from a legal perspective, is there a, I mean, there isn't a statute of limitations on any of this, but is there a practical risk that details will be lost by the tide of time? And is it conspiratorial to think that that is part of the motivation on part of people in government to delay the process now, or is it naive to think otherwise?
I don't know the answer. I'm sorry. I like, you know, we love to think conspiratorially, but I suspect it's incompetence. Usually great conspiracies are just incompetence.
Thanks. Matt, I'm going to come to you in a second, but my colleague Katie Vanek-Smith, you've written in the chat that you're struck by the language, especially of hurt, and the lack of empathy is so obvious in a mission of this government. Do you think that it could save itself a lot of the grief that it gets from its critics by just changing the way it talks? And other leaders, spokespeople that you've seen around the world who make you think, God, I wish we had people talking more like that?
I think it's sort of a theme that I've seen throughout this conversation, which ultimately, you know, the fact that this government think an 80-seat majority is the end of, and the beginning, you know, that's the end of trying to win people's hearts and minds. And now we've got the power and we can get on and do stuff, rather than thinking of that as the beginning, right? You're in, and that's the start of something rather than the end of something. And so I think this sort of, it feels like we've heard the word arrogance, we've heard, you know, all of these, it's a very, it struck me at the beginning. I was like, yes, government needs complete radical reinvention. And maybe actually it isn't government and the system of government. Maybe it's the type of people we recruit as leaders. So as I was listening to this, you know, I mean, maybe the two are you know, maybe they're linked, but I was just thinking more, actually, if you had different type of leaders, people who listened and showed more empathy, and actually saw power as something that you use differently, it comes all the way back round to right at the beginning of COVID. We had a conversation about how we thought one of the big things they were getting wrong was how they were communicating with people. So is it government, or is it the type of people that are attracted to being in government? And, you know, where is the issue? Is it in those that see the power as something that they can use for themselves, or is it that the people that want to earn the right to have that power every day? And I just think there's a nuance in all of this, and I'm struck by, actually, it's, for me, you know, I look at Boris Johnson and I look at Dominic Cummings, and I don't disagree with Cummings when he talks about a blob and a culture and all the things that, but the way he does it, I fundamentally disagree with the way he goes about doing anything, because I wouldn't want to be in a room with that man, in business with that man, having a conversation with that man, because I would just, anyway, so that's so for me, maybe it's an issue of leadership. And so when you ask, where do we see good leadership? I mean, I'm a massive fan of Merkel, as you know, and I'm a massive fan of Jacinta, and I'm a massive fan maybe we just need a few more women. I think there are only 6 women running departments in the civil service. Maybe just having a bit more blend of diversity in that mix would help all of this. I don't know.
I can't help thinking you're right. It's very striking that socially distanced photograph from government this week with one woman amongst all those men. Yes, that brings us back to the bogeyman. And Matt, you're not the bogeyman, but 2 quick questions. I'm sorry I haven't left you more time. Okay. Is there less or more than meets the eye with Cummings, and what would your questions be for the inquiry?
Well, very briefly, I mean, I'm a huge fan of radical reform of government, all the way back to the Thatcher era and open advertising for senior posts, through the Francis Maude reforms, etc. No objection there. I do have a suspicion of, I think there's a populist genius which we see not just in this country but elsewhere, which is to blame everyone else for failure. So if it wasn't Brussels, it was immigrants, or it was the blob, or it was officials, or it was Leeds on the line. I mean, that's what populists do. That's part of their talent. And they confuse ideas they don't like with groupthink. And they think that destruction is necessarily creative, and it isn't always. And I think if we look forward to an inquiry, which I hope happens very soon, we must never forget the line that ministers decide, advisors advise, or that one of the things that gets left out of the narrative far too often is that for almost 2 years before the pandemic, or more, before the pandemic, the political class engaged in an entirely introspective pub fight over Brexit, and the civil service was left to run the country. And the fact that the country was run at all is down to the civil service. So when we talk about the civil service, we must never forget that the country did continue to operate after a fashion. Questions I'd want to ask very briefly, just a few. I mean, would an earlier lockdown have made a difference? Was the idea of herd immunity clung to for too long? What lessons are there about supply lines and national resilience, particularly when it comes to medical supplies? Why was contact tracing dumped so quickly? Why did hospitals discharge so many patients into care homes, becoming, as one cabinet minister said to me in the middle of the pandemic, abattoirs? Why was that decision taken? And does that speak to what James was saying about the errors in individual hospitals? I mean, I think it's a really, really important point. And then a smaller point, but I think it is going to be really important. Looking at the Sunak measures that were taken, why did some of the work so badly? Like, why did it take so long for the loans to get through the banking system? In the mix, we mustn't forget that huge splurge of spending didn't work its way through the system as well as it might have. So that's just some of the questions I'd ask.
That's great. Thank you, Matt. And please, everyone, feel free to send them in, and we'll try and create the right forum to discuss them in. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. There is a collision. I think the consensus is a collision between a genuine desire among some in this government, even if many of its members are B-teamers, for radical change. A collision between that on the one hand and a series of disasters on the other. The revolutionaries find themselves in the middle of a pandemic and a self-inflicted task of extricating the country from Europe. It's enormously complex and the outcome is uncertain. And the second point that I think a lot of people draw attention to is the 5 years and the 80 members, the 80-seat majority. So whereas with a weaker government, we might see a resolution to this question, who's going to get control of the British state quicker, it seems that, like it or not, we're in for a long haul, and we will have time for a very detailed examination of the depth of thinking on the part of the revolutionaries, and there'll be quite a lot of mess between now and when we can finally see the outcome in clearer focus. But it's been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you all for taking part. It's 4 minutes past 2 on a Friday afternoon. Have a great rest of the day and weekend. Thank you very much.